Putting one new snack onto the shelves of one supermarket chain in one region cost a food company between $2,313 and $21,768 before a single box was ever sold. That range comes from the Federal Trade Commission, which opened the industry's books in 2003 and found that rolling one product out nationally could run $1.5 to $2 million in fees alone. Not advertising. Not manufacturing. Fees paid to the retailer for the right to occupy a rectangle of painted metal. And here's the part that changes how you shop. The store had already worked out that it makes more money renting that rectangle than selling what sits on it. You are not walking through a food store. You are walking through a leasing office. So think about what that price tag actually filters out. A company with $2 million can buy its way onto every shelf in the country. A company with $40,000 can buy one region once, and then it is out of money. Both of them might make an excellent product. Only one of them gets to find out. The FTC noted this directly in its study that slotting fees function as a barrier to entry for smaller suppliers, and that the smaller the supplier, the harder the barrier bites. Which means the aisle you're standing in is not a ranking of the best food available. It's a ranking of who could pay the entrance fee. Every empty space in that aisle was auctioned. The winners are on the shelf, the losers are not on the shelf, and you have never heard of them, which is exactly the point. To understand why a grocer would do this, you have to look at what a grocer actually earns. Industry surveys from the Food Industry Association have put supermarket net profit margins at roughly 1 to 2% of sales for decades. 1 to 2%. On $100 of groceries, the store keeps something like $1.50. A restaurant would consider that a catastrophe. A software company would consider it a rounding error. And the grocer is carrying refrigeration, spoilage, labor, rent, and a truck fleet to earn it. Now imagine somebody walks into your 1.5% business and offers you $20,000 in cash for one product in one region with no cost of goods attached, no spoilage risk, and no truck. You would take it. Every grocer took it. What happened next is that the supermarket quietly split into two businesses standing in the same building. Business one sells food to you at a razor-thin margin, and that business is genuinely hard. Business two sells access to you, to the companies that make the food, and that business is almost pure profit. Business two subsidizes business one. The reason a gallon of milk can be priced at or below cost, the reason there's a stack of bananas near the door at a price that barely covers the boat, is that those items were never supposed to make money. They're the traffic. You are the inventory. The food on the shelves is the tenant, the aisle is the floor space, and the rent is collected long before you reach the register. And once the shelf is a rental market, it develops a price map, like any other real estate. Eye level costs more than ankle level because eye level converts better, which is why the sugary cereals for children sit low, at the eye level of a child, and the cereals for adults sit high. The end cap, that display at the mouth of the aisle, is one of the most expensive positions in the entire store, and it is very rarely a bargain. It's a paid placement that looks like a bargain. The bin by the checkout, the shelf edge tag, the second facing that makes a brand look more popular than it is, all of it has a price. You have spent your whole life reading a map you thought was about food. It was a map of who paid. Then there's a practice that goes one step further. It's called the category captain. A retailer picks the largest supplier in a category, and that supplier advises the store on how the entire category should be laid out. Which products go where, how much space each one gets, and sometimes which products should be dropped. The dominant brand is handed the pencil and asked to draw the shelf that its own competitors will have to live on. The FTC has flagged the obvious conflict here that a captain has every incentive to recommend a plan that quietly starves a rival. The retailer accepts it anyway because the captain does the analysis for free, and free analysis is very attractive when your margin is 1.5%. In September of 1999, the United States Senate held a hearing on slotting fees, and the food manufacturers who came to testify did something you almost never see in an open democratic proceeding. They testified with black hoods over their heads and their voices electronically altered so that nobody could identify them. These were not organized crime informants. They were people who made salad dressing and cookies. They believed that if a retailer learned they had described the fee system out loud to a Senate committee, their products would be removed from the shelves and their companies would not survive it. That is the clearest measurement anyone has ever taken of this power imbalance. Not a number. A room full of business owners who would only tell the truth about their customers if you disguise their voices first. If you're finding this useful, subscribing genuinely helps, because these episodes take weeks of digging through regulatory filings that nobody reads for fun. It costs you nothing and it keeps this going. Thanks. Now, back to the fee structure, because the entrance fee was only the beginning. Because getting onto the shelf was never the end of the payment. It was the start of a subscription. Once a product is listed, the supplier can face what the industry calls pay-to-stay fees, ongoing payments simply to remain in a spot it already bought. There are fees for being included in the weekly flyer, fees for the end cap, fees for a promotional price the supplier funds itself, and in some agreements, a failure fee, where if the product doesn't hit an agreed sales target, the supplier pays the retailer for the disappointment, on top of the money already spent to get there. Read that structure carefully and you'll notice something. The retailer collects whether the product succeeds or fails. The risk was transferred entirely to the person who made the food. Add all of these together and the industry has a name for it, trade spend, and analysts have long estimated it at somewhere around $200 billion a year in the United States alone. For a typical packaged food company, trade spend is often the second largest line on the income statement, behind only the cost of making the product. Larger than advertising, larger than research, larger than the salaries of everyone who develops the recipes. Which means the single biggest thing a food company does with its money, after buying ingredients, is pay retailers. And that money doesn't come from nowhere. It's built into the wholesale price, which is built into the shelf price, which is the number you're squinting at while you decide between 2 jars of pasta sauce. For a long time, nobody outside the industry could see how large this money had become, and then in 2014 it became visible in the worst possible way. Tesco, Britain's largest grocer, announced it had overstated its profits, and the final figure came to £326 million. The cause was the way it had booked commercial income, the payments it received from suppliers. Recognize those payments early, delay the costs, and the accounts look healthier than the business is. The Serious Fraud Office investigated, and in 2017 Tesco entered a deferred prosecution agreement, carrying a penalty of around £129 million, plus a compensation scheme for investors. Look at what that story reveals. Supplier payments weren't a side income at the country's biggest grocer. They were large enough that mistiming them could rewrite the company's profits. Britain's response is the most interesting part because it's one of the few places that tried to regulate this directly. Under the Groceries Supply Code of Practice, and later a dedicated regulator called the Groceries Code Adjudicator, large UK supermarkets face binding limits on how they treat suppliers, including restrictions on demanding payments for better shelf positioning outside of agreed promotions, and on changing supply terms retroactively. The adjudicator can investigate and, in principle, fine. It exists because the same investigation that exposed Tesco's accounting also exposed how routinely suppliers were being asked for money after the fact. The rules aren't perfect, and enforcement is limited. But there is a country where a supplier can complain about a shelf fee to a government office, and that country is not the United States. And here's the strange part. The United States wrote a law against exactly this in 1936. It's called the Robinson-Patman Act, and it makes it illegal for a seller to give one buyer better prices, allowances, or promotional payments than a competing buyer, unless the difference reflects real cost savings. A fee structure where the biggest chain gets terms a corner grocer could never get is close to the plain text of what that statute was written to stop. It was passed during the Depression precisely because chain stores were using their buying power to extract terms independents couldn't match. The law never went away. It was simply set aside, treated for decades as an antique that interfered with low prices, and enforcement went quiet for roughly 40 years, until it briefly didn't. In January of 2025, the FTC filed a Robinson-Patman case against PepsiCo, alleging it had given a very large retail customer promotional advantages that competing grocers didn't get, which those smaller grocers then had to absorb in the prices they charged. It was the kind of case the agency hadn't brought in a generation, and it went straight at the mechanics we've been describing. Then the commission's leadership changed, and in May of 2025 the case was dismissed, described by the new majority as legally weak. 5 months, start to finish. Whatever you think of the merits, the pattern is worth holding on to. The law that would govern shelf rent is still on the books. The decision to use it changes with an election. Now, if renting shelves is so profitable, why does anyone refuse? Because there's another way to solve it, and Aldi built a company on it. A typical American supermarket carries somewhere around 30,000 distinct items. Aldi carries about 1,400, and the overwhelming majority are its own brands. Trader Joe's runs a similar shape, a few thousand items, mostly its own label. Costco does it with around 4,000. And when the store owns the brand, there is nobody to collect a slotting fee from because the tenant and the landlord are the same company. The fee disappears. So does the choice. You get 8 products instead of 40, and they're the 8 the buyer picked, not the 8 that paid, which explains something you've watched happen without being told why. Store brands in the United States have been setting records, with the Private Label Manufacturers Association reporting sales in the region of $271 billion in 2024, and roughly a quarter of every unit sold. Retailers describe this as giving shoppers value, and often it genuinely is cheaper. But look at it through the shelf rent lens. A store brand pays no slotting fee, and it competes for space against products that do. The landlord has entered the market as a tenant, while still deciding who gets the best rooms. And the store brand sits at eye level surprisingly often, in a spot that a national brand would have had to purchase. The last thing to understand is that this system didn't stay in the building. When you search for coffee on a retailer's website, the top results are frequently paid, and that's the same rented shelf with a different surface. Amazon's advertising business reported revenue in the range of $56 billion in 2024. Walmart's advertising arm has been growing at double digits and reached the billions annually. This category, retail media, carries margins that physical grocery retail can only dream of because there is no spoilage on a search result. It is the purest expression of the model. The retailer figured out decades ago that its most valuable asset was never the food. It was your attention, walking predictably past a fixed set of positions, and that asset can be sold over and over. So the next time you reach for the middle shelf, understand what you're holding. Part of that price is ingredients, and part is the truck, and part is the store's $1.50. And part of it, a part nobody prints, is the rent that product paid to be within arm's reach of you instead of 2 feet lower, or in a warehouse, or never manufactured at all. That's not a scandal exactly. It's a business model that everyone in the industry understands, and almost nobody outside it has been told about. The supermarket is not in the food business, it's in the real estate business, and the tenants pay in cash and you pay in the only currency you brought, which is the price on the tag and the illusion that you chose, which is the same trick one layer down. Once you accept that the shelf is rented, ask what happens inside the package sitting on it. The price on the tag held still while the contents quietly retreated. That's shrinkflation, and it's on screen now. Go watch it.